Oh, wow. That's like, I've never heard an audience quiet down that quickly. Thank you. Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Brett, for being here.
Thank you for having me.
So I just want to welcome everyone on behalf of the DeWitt Wallace Center for Media and Democracy and the Stanford School of Public Policy. I want to thank our co-sponsors, the American Grand Strategy Program and the Center for Jewish Studies. But mostly, I want to thank you for coming from your home outside New York, taking the time to be here with us.
This is for me just a chance to hang out with you.
Well, yeah,
This is all extra.
Truth be told, Brett and I did a much more important thing earlier today. Tell them what we did with our afternoon.
We took Regan for a walk. That was the number one thing.
Yeah.
Then number two thing is we met with your really superb students.
Yes.
And you guys are number three.
And I'm going to make you re-say some of the things you said to students, but you're not going to mind that, right?
I hope not.
I think most of you are here because you know about Brett's career, you know about him, but I'll just say a few words. I can't capture your career in a couple of sentences. Brett is obviously now, since 2017, right, an op-ed columnist with the New York Times. He was with the Wall Street Journal before then, also as a columnist where he won the Pulitzer Prize in commentary. And before then, he was the editor-in-chief of the Jerusalem Post, which he talked to the students a little bit about the experience of covering Israel. I bet we're gonna start off by really embarrassing you, if that's okay. But I need glasses to embarrass you. I'm betting, because so many people are fans of it, that a lot of people here are big fans of the conversation that you do weekly with Gail Collins. How many people read that? A lot, right? Deservedly so. I'm just gonna read, the conversation has become famous for your 1 or 2 or 3 liners. And so just since we'll get to much lighter stuff like the future of American democracy, I figured we'd begin with really serious stuff, and I would just read some of your greatest recent hits.
I'm nervous already.
No, this is good. You just have to sit there and blush, okay? Bret Stephens on Donald Trump's evolving excuses for absconding with classified documents. With Trump, the line between the shambolic and the sinister is often blurred. His entire being is like Inspector Clouseau doing an impression of Jack Nicholson in The Shining, or maybe vice versa.
I did write that, yeah.
On Mike Pence's one redemptive moment, Pence was a worm who, for a few hours on January 6th, turned into a glowworm.
That was borrowed from Winston Churchill. I just have to.
Oh my gosh! Did you get plagiarism complaints?
No, it wasn't plagiarism. I expected my intelligent readers to know the glowworm reference.
On our 2 political parties at this distressing juncture, every time I think of Democrats and lose my hope, I think of Republicans and lose my lunch.
I wrote that too.
That wasn't Churchill, right?
That was me.
Okay. On the scarcity of certain goods during the pandemic, the supply chain situation has gotten so out of hand that there's even a cream cheese shortage at New York City bagel shops, which is like one of the 10 biblical plagues as reimagined by Mel Brooks.
Did I write that?
According to the internet, you did.
Apparently.
Google says you did, and Google knows everything. And then finally, on your own brief bout with COVID, I lost my senses of taste and smell, which, given that I've received multiple care packages from Zabar's, makes me feel like the eunuch at the orgy. So those are all from the conversation. And again, before we get too serious, since I know there are a lot of fans of it, I constantly get asked, since I know you and Gail, as if I would know the answers, how do you two put it together? Are you in a room together? Do you do it over a finite period, over several days? Can you just really briefly take us inside the production of the conversation?
Yes, first of all, thank you for coming. I am sincerely honored to be here, and I wouldn't have come but for Frank, who was the most welcoming person at the New York Times, which isn't necessarily saying much.
It's a low bar, yeah.
But Frank really was my friend from the beginning, and it's a friendship that's endured. And I'm so happy to see you here in this beautiful space. The conversation is a very, how it happens, how it comes together is very simple. It comes together over a Google Doc, which is a document we both have access to. We work very hard to sound as stupid as possible. And that's not that much work, in my case at any rate. The idea is that we are trying to play a game of tennis, but not play it for points. We're just trying to keep the ball in the air. And it's called a conversation. It's not called an argument. So I sometimes will read the comments to the conversation, and those comments think that we're supposed to be scoring aces against one another. Actually, we're just enjoying one another's company and the pleasure of sometimes agreeing and sometimes disagreeing. And above all, the greater pleasure of being able to enter at least the virtual room as friends and leave as friends so that we can have a conversation the following week. And there's a lot to be said for this, I think, particularly in this day and age where people think that political differences should always lead to a kind of form of mortal combat. I think that's one of the great diseases of American democracy, and to our theme, it's a disease that was massively accelerated by the brain death of the Republican Party over the last several years. So we try not to bring in too many statistics. Every now and then there's a quote that I think is really useful, and I'll mention it. Both of us go out of our way to praise the work of our colleagues. It's supposed to be a relatively happy space. And what's interesting is it's one of the most popular features in the Times. We know this from the way in which we track engagement. People read it from beginning to end. And if you look for the conversation on social media, it almost doesn't exist. Twitter doesn't take notice. Other forms of social media don't take notice because those are media where the algorithms are really built for outrage. And we are not, I mean, we'll get our barbs in, right? But we are not trying to be an outrage factory. We're trying to model a concept of civil disagreement, which I think the country needs.
And I think one of the reasons it's so popular is because you're trying to model that sort of dialogue. Why do people come to that, clearly yearning for that and liking that, and why are they not able to then return to their lives and practice it in their own lives?
Well, I think people actually do practice it. And to coin a phrase, I think there's a silent majority of people who, first of all, don't belong to the extremes and don't want the political music always played like in Spinal Tap at 11, right? They prefer the dial more around the 4 and 5 level. But we have organized our media in a way that what I really believe is a majority of people, don't find outlets, don't find expression. Whether it's on MSNBC and certainly on Fox, the typical mode of American discourse is screaming. That's how somehow we have organized political conversations. I don't think that's representative at all. And so I think people are coming to the conversation and finding a kind of sanctuary. I think, by the way, it's something, given the fact that we know it's successful, it's a formula that ought to be replicated widely. It would be great in your local newspapers or here, at the university elsewhere, finding occasions to bring people with diverse views, but basically well-intentioned people together in a room to have conversations, always with the idea that at the end of the evening, as we will tonight, we're going to go to a dinner and we're going to break bread together.
You mentioned moments ago the brain death of the Republican Party. Are you at this point in time a man without a party?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I'm trying to remember what the last straw was for me, but probably Roy Moore's Senate candidacy. I mean, by then I was kind of gone already, but that's, I think, when I changed my party affiliation to independent. And to me, I think it's a national tragedy. My own rootlessness politically doesn't bother me so much because, my vote doesn't matter all that much anyway. And B, I've never seen myself as a partisan, but it's a national tragedy in this sense, in that every healthy society needs a healthy conservative party. Why? Because conservatism is not just an ideology. It's an instinct, it's a tendency, it's a temperament. And that temperament needs to find political expressions which are constructive and healthy and actually contribute something to a richer and fuller and more meaningful type of political discourse and dialogue. And the Republican Party at its best, whether it was under Abraham Lincoln in the 1860s or under a reformer like Teddy Roosevelt at the beginning of the 20th century, or in my view, and I know not everyone will share this, with Ronald Reagan at the end of the Cold War, served great purposes in American politics, not least of which was it served to pull the other side back from some of its own most extreme tendencies. That now is gone, right? That's now we have a conservative party that's not healthy, that's unhealthy, I think in many ways is malignant, and is slowly adopting a political philosophy that it calls national conservatism, but actually has a number of features which can only be described as fascistic and frequently cruel. So go back to 1980 and find on YouTube a debate between George H.W. Bush and Ronald Reagan talking about the best way to improve relations with Mexico and adopt a more welcoming immigrant to Mexican migrants coming across the border, and contrast that to what the party has become today. Look at something like Ron DeSantis sending 50 human beings to serve as political props for what he expects is going to be a political campaign. That's particularly painful to me because my mother was a refugee to this country, arrived here with $7 as a former hidden child during the Holocaust. The whole tenor of the Republican Party, with its disdain not just for immigration but for democracy itself, is sickening to behold. And I do think that some set of people have to hold on to a concept of conservatism, even if it's like, it reminds me of the book How the Irish Saved Civilization. In a little monastery off at the far edge of the world, right, while the rest of Europe was being swept with barbarism, because there is a concept, which I'd like to talk about tonight, of conservatism, which the country needs and doesn't have a political party to represent.
Well, I'm glad. I was just going to ask you, can you define this conservatism that you keep talking about?
So there are two strains, I would say, and this is, I'm talking in huge generalizations, and half of you are academics, so I'm sure you'll pick it apart during the Q&A. But I would say in a broad sense, there are two core strains of Western conservatism. One is a broadly European idea, which George Will calls the throne and altar conservatism, which is sort of conservative for the sake of being conservative, conservative in the sense of being reactionary, and reactionary in particular to the ideas of the Enlightenment, the ideas that sort of burbled up in the 17th and 18th century and became the dominant form of liberalism of their day. And this is a conservatism that essentially is arguing from a position of irrationalism, whether it's the irrationality of a particular dynasty being on the throne, a particular form of religion being the religion of the state, or just the idea of nation for nation's sake. There's a separate idea of conservatism, which I think comes out of the United States, and there are all kinds of streams which feed this, but let me just sort of broadly speak of it as American conservatism. And that is, American conservatism serves the purposes of preserving a political order that is itself inherently liberal. So what does a thoughtful conservative want to preserve? A political concept going back to the Declaration of Independence, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and a constitutional concept going back to the Constitution, not so much of 1787, but really of 1865, 1868, the amendments after the Civil War, and preserving that as an idea that is not only worth celebrating and defending, but is best protected through a set of institutions that are not themselves political. So I hope I'm making sense. So, you know, why do conservatives believe in the family? They believe in the family because they believe that families are well equipped to produce children who can become responsible and productive citizens. Why do they believe in the free market? Because we believe that the competition and innovation that free markets provide are useful not just for prosperity, but for creating citizens who can own responsibly their own liberties. Why do we admire the military? Again, because we believe that the military is capable of fashioning something quite remarkable. People like General Mark Milley, who believe that the power of the United States has to be in the service of a constitutional order. These are the set of ideas. And why do we believe in a kind of originalism when it comes to the Supreme Court jurisprudence? Largely for the same set of ideas, that we don't want the Constitution to stop resembling what the founders and then the makers of the amendment and the makers of laws originally intended. And that, I think, one can argue with that, right? I think you can make reasonable non-conservative arguments against it. But I think that is a defensible and honorable and necessary concept of what conservative thought ought to be. And it's what I am trying, and a few other people I can think of, people like Mark Gerson at the Washington Post, Anne Applebaum is another great example, Caitlin Flanagan at the Atlantic. There are a few of us who more or less, we have differences here and there, more or less have this sense of what a conservative movement ought to look like. And, as Maximus says in the movie Gladiator, there was a dream that was Rome, this is not it. Well, that's kind of like, we feel that way. Unfortunately, I hope I don't end up stabbed and dead on the floor of the arena at the end of the...
Not on my watch,
okay.
No. You just mentioned a bunch of journalists who you think get it. Are there any politicians out there in either party who model the kind of conservatism you're talking about?
So I was going to say, if you had asked me this question yesterday, I was going to say Ben Sass, but then I read Carlos Losada's devastating piece about him, and now I'm kind of stroking my chin and saying, well, maybe I should have read this book. Unfortunately, they're all, this is another line, I think, from my last conversation. Gail asked me, are the Republicans I admired, and it's like the pantheon of has-beens. I admire Liz Cheney. I admire Adam Kinzinger. I admire Larry Hogan, the governor of, or I guess still governor of Maryland. Charlie Baker. There are lots of Republicans I admire. They're just formers.
Yeah. Did Donald Trump significantly wound a conservatism that was more or less healthy, or did he have an opening because conservatism had already betrayed itself?
So this is a great, great question, and it eats at me, right? Because I wasn't just a columnist for the Wall Street Journal. I was the deputy editor of the editorial page. So I was fairly close to the center of the conservative movement for most of my, or much of my adult life. And when Donald Trump came around, it felt like the invasion of the body snatchers, like literally, or something from outer space. I'm trying to think of that movie from the 70s or 80s where
Close Encounters?
Yeah, Close Encounters of the Third Kind, like the spaceship arrived, right? And now in hindsight, I have to ask myself, was I deluded? And there's evidence that I was, because there was a lot of information about the Republican Party, say 10 years ago, that seemed to me trivial information, and now in the light of what's happened actually becomes much more relevant. So I never thought of Pat Buchanan as a significant figure in the Republican Party. I thought of him as a kind of an interesting, I find him detestable, but interesting in a kind of, broad sense of the term, character who sort of was at the margins of a party, much in the way that, let's say, Bernie Sanders seemed to be at the margins of the Democratic Party for most of his career. Turns out much more central than I realized. People will sometimes talk about Nixon's Southern strategy, which was unquestionably a race-baiting strategy. And I would say, yes, but if you actually look at Nixon as president, Nixon did a fair amount for civil rights. Now I have to go back and ask myself, I was mistaking the signal for, or the noise for the signal, as a matter of fact. So there were tendencies within the Republican Party that were clearly coursing through it, and then found their moment kind of weirdly, but at the same time not so weirdly, in the person of Trump. I will say this, however. I think three things happened in the last 12 years which transformed, or allowed the party to tip into something, to tip into what it became. And these were things for which the establishment part of the Republican Party, or the conservative movement to which I was a member, had real responsibilities and need to do a lot of soul searching about. Number one, we initiated a couple of wars that turned into fiascos and were later abandoned by the people who had enthusiastically approved of them. And many of the people who went and fought in those wars were the types of people who ended up becoming vehement supporters of Donald Trump. Secondly, we had a financial crisis in 2008 where banks were bailed out, well-to-do people were bailed out, people with money in stock markets did just fine after 2008 with a little bit of a dip, and the rest of the country did not nearly as well. And those are two aspects that really the Republicans like me need to hold ourselves sort of stringently to account. The third aspect, I think, comes from the other side, which is that even though we're all dressed the same, there's been a kind of cultural revolution in this country in the last 10 years, for better in many respects, for worse in some respects. But some of the cultural assumptions that were true 10 years ago are just no longer true today. The most obvious example of which are your pronouns at the bottom of your email address. And a lot of Americans were just not on board for this, especially because they feel like it was imposed on them without their consent. And that, I think, was the third transformation that brought Trump about.
I asked this because you mentioned Nixon and the Southern strategy. At this point in time, is the Republican Party a racist party?
Yeah, I want to be careful. Are Republicans, by and large, racist people? I don't know, and I don't think so, and I'd like to think not. I think that what has happened, however, is that strains of racism have become overt, unmistakable, and terrifying in the Republican Party. And not just racism, but speaking now in a different vein as a Jew, anti-Semitism. And you just have to look at the fact that Tucker Carlson had this interview with, I guess he's now known as Ye, Kanye to the rest of us, in which he deliberately omitted anti-Semitic comments that Kanye made because he was trying to burnish Kanye's reputation. Kanye then did us the gift of his DEFCON 3, gave us the gift of his DEFCON 3 tweet to eliminate all doubt. To me, also, the other aspect, racism is too narrow a term, right? It's a whole efflorescence of bigotries. And the other aspect of it is the bigotry against immigrants, and particularly immigrants from Latin America. And the idea that it's a, quote, invasion, and that these people can be used as DeSantis did, as props in their drama. By the way, I'm in favor of good border security, just as I'm in favor of a liberal immigration policy. But the idea that these desperate human beings who are coming to our shores, right, as our grandparents or many of our great-grandparents did, represent some kind of profound threat to American life, that they are some kind of alien force, is horrendous and is antithetical to what this country ought to be about. Again, this idea I have of conservatism is we are trying to preserve the possibility of a truly open society.
You mentioned anti-Semitism, and I did want to come back around to that. You've written some about that, been in the news a lot lately. I mean, is this a resurgence, or how do you, if you could contextualize what we're seeing right now in terms of just kind of hate across the board, but also in terms of history?
Well, look, anti-Semitism is one of those diseases that never goes away. And for some period of time, I guess after the Holocaust, it became unfashionable until it stopped becoming so unfashionable. So, and it's, I should emphasize, it is an across-the-board phenomenon which manifests itself in different ways. There is the obvious, unmistakable anti-Semitism of someone like the shooter at the Pittsburgh synagogue. There was the anti-Semitism in Kanye's comment. But here, I'll probably upset some people in the audience. I think there's a lot of anti-Semitism on the left. and it's an anti-Semitism that refuses to own up to what it is. It goes by the name of anti-Zionism, and by the way, there are a million ways to criticize Israel that are absolutely legitimate and in some cases necessary, right? But when anti-Zionism adopts all of the tropes of traditional anti-Semitism, strikes me as anti-Semitism. And that has to be called out as well. I think it is terrifying that today Jews are the single biggest victims of religious discrimination in this country. And if I mention this, probably this is new information to a lot of you. It is new information that on any given day in places like Williamsburg and elsewhere where there are large identifiable Jewish communities, anti-Semitism, including violent anti-Semitism, is becoming the norm. It should also be worrisome that at academic institutions, lots of Jewish students will tell you, I am afraid to be visibly Jewish, or I'm afraid to express certain opinions because I feel like I'm going to be canceled. And I think it is a responsibility of administrators, if they're concerned for the feelings of safety and security of other students of traditionally persecuted or discriminated against minorities, they should show exactly the same kind of solicitude towards their Jewish students, and that's not happening nearly as much as it should be.
Would the mapping project be better known and more intensely criticized if it was focused on a different minority group? And maybe you should tell people who don't know what the mapping project is.
I don't know what the mapping project is.
Oh, we'll move on from that then.
What is the mapping project?
Well, I'm going to get it wrong, but I was counting on you to know it better. It's been a big issue at Wellesley in terms of a student article the student paper ran. I'm going to misspeak, and rather than misspeak, which I do way too often anyway, I'm just going to move on.
Okay.
But we began by talking about Republicans and the right. You are also in print frequently and expansively critical of the left.
Yes.
And you used the word illiberalism before about what's going on in the Republican Party, but you also see a profound illiberalism on the left. Do you equate the two? Do you think they have anything to do with each other? Talk a little bit about that.
Well, illiberalisms tend to show up at the far ends of either political spectrum, and often they become mirror images of one another. Some of you may have seen this wonderful German TV drama, Babylon, Berlin, where the Reds are battling the Browns, but they're kind of equally detestable. And so this is a phenomenon in politics. There is a tremendous streak of illiberalism on the left. And again, I'm an equal opportunity offender. I've said all kinds of things about the Republican Party. I find myself aghast at a lot of corners of the Democratic Party, the more so-called progressive corners that respond to speech they don't like by not only trying to shut it down, but trying to virtually erase the people who offer views that are contrary to their own. Now, it's one thing for someone who's on the right to want to censure people, because that's what conservatives do, right? I mean, they're the party of censure, right? They're the party of the McCarthyites, allegedly, right? This is their brand. But when people go around saying, I'm incredibly open-minded, except for you, Frank, you need to shut up and go away and die. I'm going to strip you not only of your right to speak, I'm going to strip you of your job, I'm going to strip you of your reputation. Go work at a Starbucks for all I care and vanish, right? But worse than that, because you can't find employment anywhere, right? That's a problem. And I don't understand how people who tell themselves that they are open-minded, educated people prepared to entertain a variety of opinions will then turn around and say, Bret Stephens is so fascistic, it's unbelievable. Like, I'm fascistic? Let me introduce you to some of my friends. That's...
But where do we draw the line? Like, whether it's a person coming to campus to speak, whether it's something we denounce or not, where does open-mindedness rightly end?
Well, wonderful question to which there's only the Potter Stewart reply about pornography that you know it when you see it, right?
Is it Milo? Is it Ann Coulter? Is it someone else? Where does it,
Look, I generally think, first of all, I don't like the term hate speech. There is hateful speech in my eyes. But on the whole, the idea of defining something as hate speech strikes me as a well-intended but illiberal exercise. If a hateful speaker is coming, or someone you consider a hateful speaker is coming to your campus, don't attend, right? If the best reception that someone like Milo, someone I truly dislike, could get if he were to come to a place like Duke is an empty hall, right? You would be honoring the principles of free speech, and you would also honor your right to deny him the very thing that he seeks the most, which is an audience. Now, speech that incites to violence, absolutely. I mean, there are clear legal lines that have been drawn out in jurisprudence. But on the whole, we learn things when we encounter error. And I love this line from Jefferson's first inaugural address when he says, "Error of opinion may be tolerated where reason is left free to combat it." I think that's a wonderful standard for an open society.
I want to use that as a segue. I learned something about you when we were walking into class today that I didn't know. I didn't realize that you had taught political rhetoric at University of Chicago.
Yeah.
And you mentioned that you were teaching great speeches. What are 3 great speeches that all of us should reread every year?
Well, the Gettysburg Address always repays very close attention. You could literally spend a class on every single line of the Gettysburg Address. It's not a speech, but Letter from Birmingham Jail is a masterpiece of philosophy and rhetoric, which has, I think, no parallel, probably not equaled almost anywhere, and certainly in 20th century American history. And then probably because of the Shakespearean echoes of it, any one of Churchill's major wartime speeches, we shall fight them on the landing fields and the streets, that also is worth reading because it is in fact a prose poem of defiance, written in language that I don't think has been exceeded anywhere in English except for maybe with some of Shakespeare's plays. But it was a wonderful course. First of all, I'd never taught before, and the dean at Chicago said, "Why don't you teach a class, to our students?" I said, "Sure." And it happened that I started teaching in the spring of 2020 when COVID hit. So I was supposed to teach a 3-hour seminar for 11 sessions or 12 sessions over the span of a term. Turns out, to all you teachers out there, what you do is hard. Oh my God. I mean, towards the very end, my wife would actually slip me a glass of wine because I was faltering.
Only towards the end?
Well, I wanted to maintain reasonable sobriety for most of it. But you learn a lot because there is, we've now come to look at politics and rhetoric as avenues of debasement. And when you're reading King or Lincoln or Churchill, a whole bunch of others, you actually are reminded of the humane possibilities in great political thinking where the word inspires the deed and then the deed redeems the word.
In about 7 or 8 minutes, I'm going to let you all ask questions, and I think they're going to set up some microphones. And if you want to ask a question, when you see those microphones, just line up behind them, and then we'll just kind of go from microphone to microphone. Okay. You are, the Times has added columnists, but correct me if I'm wrong, I think you and Tom Friedman remain the only 2 who really focus on foreign affairs. Yeah. Is that right? And you have written quite a bit about the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Yeah. What do you, if you could review, I mean, briefly, the Biden administration's decisions in that regard so far, do you think they've been correct or incorrect? And what are your fears going forward? How do you see this playing out?
Yikes. Well, first of all, I want to boast about something. This is the proudest achievement in my career. I was in May banned for life from ever visiting Russia. And I was so proud of my wife was thrilled by this, so we actually framed the order banning me.
You got it in the mail, or?
Well, what I framed was the New York Times announcement that I'd been banned. With the actor Morgan Freeman and President Biden. I thought, this is decent company. All right, the Pulitzer went down and the band went up on my wall. Look, I think when we had our shambolic withdrawal from Afghanistan, whatever you think of the decision, the manner of the execution was appalling, and I think that set the stage for Putin's belief that he could invade Ukraine in a kind of a coup de main without serious American opposition. And so I scored Biden very harshly back in August of 2021, and I actually predicted that pretty soon Russia would want to bite off another chunk of Ukraine, and the Beijing would want to do the same with Taiwan. But since the beginning of the war, I've generally given Biden pretty good marks in first of all, understanding that this was a challenge not to Ukrainian sovereignty, this was a challenge to global order writ large, and that if Ukraine could fall, then other countries would fall, and the law of the jungle would be, once again, we'd be back to the 1930s. I give him fantastic marks, I think, not only for supplying Ukraine with what it needed, but by maintaining that supply and by marshaling genuinely a reasonable bipartisan group of legislators to support us. So I think Biden's, I mean, I have loads of criticism for Biden, but this is his finest hour. And he has handled this with, I think, great aplomb. It reminds me, his handling of this war so far reminds me of George H.W. Bush with the war you covered, the first Gulf War, in assembling a global consensus and then supplying the Ukrainians with what they need, with the proviso that any time in the next few weeks we could have a nuclear detonation somewhere in eastern Ukraine.
So I think, you'll correct me on the date, but 9 months to a year ago, ahead of the curve, you wrote an unequivocal column saying Biden should not run again. Does his handling of the Russia-Ukraine situation change your mind about that?
No, I think Biden ran with the implicit understanding that he was a one-termer. I think he does himself no favors by trying to end the presidency, with all respect to anyone who's of certain years, as an 86-year-old man. The presidency, I mean, look at Barack Obama's hair between 2008 and 2016. This is a job that ages you.
At least he kept it. Could be worse.
Could be worse, that's true. But no one who is a serious student of the presidency can come away with anything but the impression that this is a job that absolutely saps the life of you. And I think also for the sake of the Democratic Party, they need a vigorous candidate in 2024.
You, when you visited my class just before this,
Yeah.
You made a wonderful argument for journalism as a profession, even at a moment in time when people say it's dying or it's lost all respect. Could you make that argument again here?
What did I say? Look, the world is always going to need people who can accurately tell the world's stories and tell them in a way that is meaningful and factual and fair and true. And whatever the medium and whatever the transitions between one medium to the next, I think that need is going to be permanent. In fact, I think it's growing. You know, one of the great challenges of democratic life is that there is more of a supply of information than there is what you might call necessary information. There's a tremendous amount of noise. At any given moment, any one of us can go on the internet and find out a tremendous amount of information on just any subject within seconds. Who gets to make, who can make sense of this, and who can make sense of this in a way that enriches and empowers our lives? I think the best people to do that are journalists and great journalistic institutions like the Times, like the Washington Post, Wall Street Journal. I think that's incredibly important work, and who also can bring that information not to societies that have an overabundance of information, but but to societies that don't have enough information, whether it's the Russian people who are being misled about the war they're engaged in, or the Iranian people who are hungry to have outlets for, especially Iranian women, for what they are trying to achieve there. So the importance of the profession, I think, is a constant in human affairs. And the fact is that in the last few years, the New York Times went from being a paper that was in real trouble financially to a paper that is flourishing because people are hungry for authoritative, interesting, wide-ranging, curious journalism. So to the extent that this and a handful of other great papers are doing it, it's wonderful. And now technologies also allow individual actors to produce meaningful journalism without the backing of huge institutions. So I think the opportunities are extraordinarily ripe. And nowadays everyone wants to be in STEM, right? Because it seems to be the avenue for a future career. I feel like in 30 years, today's young journalists or aspiring journalists are going to look back and say, I'm glad I chose that profession. It turned out it was the growth profession, just nobody knew it at the time.
So if you are a young person who aspires to go into journalism, if you want to be one of these intelligent makers, sense makers of the world, what are the things you must do to prepare yourself to be that intelligent witness?
Read really widely. Read widely, talk to lots of people, and talk to people with an abiding sense of curiosity and the possibility of learning something, even from those with whom, or especially from those with whom you have fundamental disagreements. And the other thing I would add is when I was a kid, my father, of blessed memory, forced me to memorize reams and reams of poetry. It's such a great exercise, and it so informs the way I approach and think about sentences.
I'm going to ask you one more question, and then, so are the microphones in the back, or are they coming up to the front, or? Yeah, I'm going to ask you one more, and then I'll hand it over to you all. If I'm a young person in this audience, or even as an old person in this audience.
You're not so old.
Yeah, I'm pretty old. I look at you and I think, okay, this guy has it so together. You probably just, it was a glide path from college to your current situation because you are so articulate, so intelligent. I want you to tell the students here the most embarrassing story you have about a mistake you made as a journalist early on. And this isn't a setup. I don't know the answer, but he's got to have one, right?
Oh, I've got many. Look, I mean, beneath this semi-smooth exterior, I'm a bundle of like massive Jewish neuroses all the time, 24/7. In my sleep, I'm neurotic. When I was in my 20s, look, I got fired from my first job by an editor who then wrote me the most ingratiating note when I won a Pulitzer Prize. And I was so tempted to write him this dismissive, obnoxious reply, and instead I wrote, "Thank you."
Which is the most dismissive reply of all.
Well, I was so busy replying to all the fan mail I was getting. Look, when I was in my 20s, I felt like, even if this wasn't physically true, I basically felt like I was walking through life with a giant zit on my lip. And a hole in a bad place in my pants. Like I just felt continually, constantly embarrassed, out of sorts. And those of you who are still in college, you'll find this. This is why so many of you end up in law school, unfortunately. You'll find this. Graduating college is a difficult event because all of a sudden there's not another grade to go to. All of your life it's been first grade, second grade, and freshman, sophomore, and so on. And suddenly you are launched into the world. It's like a second birth, and it's a very discombobulating period of time. You make mistakes. You come out of college. I came out of Chicago thinking I'm just the smartest guy on earth, and obviously some of my employers disagreed. And you will find your feet. I don't know how, but I assure you, you will.
Thank you. Sure.
Question for you about the American electorate, a segment of the American electorate. Why do you think, in your view, and this is a question for either of you, it's a question I wrestle with, that there are so many people in this country, highly intelligent, who conduct their lives with a lot of probity and integrity, form judgments on the basis of reason? Why do you, and in general, are independent in their political thinking? Why in recent years, and it continues, do you think so many of them, well, maybe not a majority, but a significant contingent of those people, faced with looking at the excesses of the left and the excesses of the right, will lean to the right, are scared more by the left, to the point that they will spend all of those other virtues and qualities in which they conduct their lives and lean towards either, voting Republican and actually may end up voting for Donald Trump? I know that's not a majority, but of that segment, there, as and I know, lots of people like that. Why do you think that's the case, that we have so many people in this country who are like that?
It's a large and difficult question, and so risking generalizations here. Number one, a lot of people, most people vote their narrow interest, right? And if for a lot of, look, when Trump was running in 2016, I had a long conversation with a guy who runs a mid-sized business in California. And this is a guy whose ethics were definitely not Trump's, and who was repelled by Trump's beliefs, demeanors, and so on. But then he took me through the kinds of regulations that he faces as a guy running a business of about 500 people in California, and they are onerous and often stupid. And he said, what can I tell you? Trump is going to solve a lot of problems for me, because he's saying he's going to get rid of all these regulations, he's going to lower my taxes. And in fact, for the first 3 years, Trump kind of delivered on those promises. I'm not asking you to agree with the prescription for social good, but from his perspective, that's the way he saw it. It was, what's in it for me? And most voters ask themselves that question. But connected to that, I also think that, I wrote this in a column, Trump was what I call a proudly raised middle finger at a self-satisfied elite, right? First, the establishment Republican Party, and then I think Hillary Clinton in some way embodied the self-satisfied elite more than any other candidate that I can think of nearly in my lifetime. And he was the guy who would stand up and say, I'm not going to apologize. I'm not going to bend to your idea, your pious ideas of propriety. So I said something dirty to some guy about women, whatever, locker room talk, and I think that appealed to a lot of people. The third aspect is that I think of, and so these are separate, is that I think of Trump as an anger funnel. And so whatever the anger was, he was a channel for it. And the angers varied from circumstance to circumstance, but he provided that kind of outlet. He was the smoldering volcano in that election. And people said, oh, it kind of reflects whatever I'm feeling inside about feeling condescended to by liberal elites, or feeling like I have not gotten a job that I believe was mine because of an affirmative action program. Whatever it was, he somehow captured that. And so I think those were the three aspects of his candidacy. By the way, Democrats would do themselves a great favor, right, if they stopped a politics of condescension, which is sometimes, not all of you may recognize it, is very prevalent on the left in this country. So a politics of sort of deep sympathy and understanding, and saying, hang on a second, maybe we should not all call them all racist. This is why I hesitated with Frank's question, right? To be able to separate people from what they might be voting for is a useful thing for Democrats to learn. So please, to the Democrats in this audience, don't put anyone in a basket of deplorables. It's as they say, it's worse than a crime, it's a mistake.
Hi. You mentioned a lot about what impacts we're bringing from how we are performing towards Ukraine and Russian conflict. What is your view on the American foreign relations towards East? For example, China, North Korea, Korea, and Japan.
Yeah. I think the most important outcome from Ukraine, the war in Ukraine, is not what will happen in Ukraine. It's what will happen in Taiwan. I think that if Ukraine falls, the lesson that Xi Jinping will draw is that ultimately he can win, and he can win dirty. And furthermore, that it's better to act soon while the West is relatively, or the United States feels relatively unprepared, rather than to wait for Taiwan to further arm itself, for the countries of East Asia, the democracies of East Asia, to strengthen themselves. I mean, this takes me back to a book I wrote almost a decade ago. But ultimately, I think that the cause of the American interest in securing political freedoms at the periphery of the security margins of America advances the cause of freedom in the United States. There is an idea that somehow if we invest in foreign policy, if we're fighting wars or putting in money to defend, say, South Korea or Japan, it's somehow taking away from democracy at home. I think it's actually enhancing it. And it is, in fact, the case that one of the reasons why the civil rights movement advanced when it did is that America became acutely conscious of the fact in the mid-1960s that if we were going to oppose communism for destroying human freedom in Russia or Poland or North Korea or wherever, we had our own accounts to reckon with here in the United States, and obviously particularly in the American South. So I don't think that this is someone once said of Jerry Ford, he can't walk and chew gum at the same time. America has to walk and chew gum at the same time. We have to be mindful of what's happening in places like Ukraine or Taiwan at the same time that we are trying to advance a concept of freedom and civil rights here in the United States.
Earlier, you addressed briefly anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, and the Times itself has a reputation for being in that band, I'll say. And yet you personally obviously hold different opinion. How do you reconcile that as you work for a paper that has that reputation amongst a lot of people?
I think it is a great thing that the most important newspaper in the world, which is the New York Times, should have a voice like mine in its pages. And the role that A.M. Rosenthal performed at the paper and Bill Sapphire is one I aspire to fill. The New York Times is not an anti-Semitic paper at all. Now, do I read stuff in the New York Times I don't like? Every day, every single day. I don't think there's anyone at the New York Times that doesn't read stuff in the New York Times that they don't like or that they disagree with. And I don't agree with a lot of the editorial positions. I realized that when I came in. I'm kind of the dissident voice, there. But I reject the allegation categorically that the Times is in any way anti-Semitic or inflected with anti-Semitism. I think it's a preposterous and false accusation. And you just have to read my column from yesterday or the gazillion columns I've written in the Times on the subject to know, by the way, written without ever a word of disapproval from any editor, that it's false.
I do read them, and I appreciate that you're there.
I would like to just follow up on that. Barry Weiss had a different opinion. She felt forced out because of anti-Semitism at the Times, and I wanted to know if this isn't my main question, but since he asked that, about whether there was any introspection or discussion after she left, because she wrote quite the letter to the editor about her reasons for leaving. And my other question is about Fox News hiding that Kanye West diatribe on anti-Semitism. If the conservatives were supposed to be the party for Israel, what has happened? And and you know, what's going on there and in the greater society, that there aren't more Republican voices commenting on that. And then also to comment on Jewish students are feeling, have been having a really difficult time as Jewish students across the country with anti-Semitism on campus. So if you could address those three things.
Barry's a dear friend of both of ours. I helped bring her to the New York Times. She and I worked together at the Wall Street Journal for many years. And I think it's a great loss that she's no longer at the paper, and the proof of that is the success of what she is doing now. The reasons she left were complex, and there were many reasons. And they also owed to sort of a unique political circumstances of 2020, and a set of decisions that I'm not going to get into now, with which I publicly disagreed. I actually wrote a column in the Times publicly disagreeing with the dismissal of our former boss and our friend James Bennett. The second question, remind me. Oh, yeah.
With Kanye West, first of all, burying that
Yeah.
anti-Semitic screed, and why they buried it if they're supposed to be the party that supports Jews in Israel.
Well, I think there have been anti-Semitic dog whistles coming out of Tucker Carlson's show for quite a while. You know, when you sort of talk about the evil hedge fund manager, Paul Singer, screwing the little guy in middle America, right? You know, a guy like David Duke would watch that, and you don't need to say the word Jew in order to kind of nod your head and say, okay, this is what this is all about. I think it is a uniquely vile program, and he's a uniquely vile and cynical person. You know, Tucker and I went to almost identical prep schools, and I know, you know, I remember when Tucker Carlson was trying to imitate Bill Buckley with his stupid bow ties. Apologies to all those of you wearing smart bow ties. And I think he is, I mean, my own view is that the transformation has been a cynical one, because he is seeking to enlarge his audience by playing to the most debased instincts of it. And, you know, one of the things I'm always mindful of when it comes to anti-Semitism is that anti-Semitism knows no party. There are people in this audience on the right who say, oh, the terrible anti-Semitism is on the left, and they're all, you know, the progressives, and they hate Israel, et cetera. Lots of truth to that. Don't close your eyes to the sulfurous anti-Semitism that is emanating from the right, often from people who will turn around and say, well, but I love Israel, I support Israel. Great, but, oh, excuse me, yeah. From the right, people on the right who say they support Israel, but then turn around and say, I'm against globalists who control the media and want open borders to substitute American workers with Hispanics. Well, that's Jews will not replace us. That's the Charlottesville rhetoric. And now, I'm sorry, I'm having one and the fun.
The Duke students, so that's on the left, you know.
Well, this is what I raised earlier here, that there's a climate on campus, which I don't think gets sufficiently recognized, of Jewish students, one after another, coming to me and saying, you know, I feel like I have to muzzle myself. I feel worried. I mean, there have been some cases that have risen above the parapet where Jewish students running for student bodies, I don't know if it's happened at Duke, but it happened, I believe, at USC, other institutions, where it's sort of clear and naked anti-Semitism. But if there's a minority on campus that is telling you again and again, we do not feel comfortable here, I think it behooves the administration to not poo-poo them, but to take it seriously, right? Just as you would with other minorities if you were getting the same feedback from them. And it's been a profound failure, I think, again, I don't want to finger Duke because I know nothing about what's going on here, but it's been a profound failure among too many institutions of higher learning in the United States that somehow When it's discrimination against the Jews, that doesn't count because Jews are, quote, white or, quote, privileged. When my mother was in hiding from the Nazis in 1940, nobody in the high command of the Gestapo thought of my mother as white.
We'll go back to this microphone. I want to try to, I don't know that we'll get to everybody. I want to try to get to as many of you as possible. So
Yeah.
if we can all kind of lightning round it a little.
All right,
Yeah.
sorry.
You, sir.
Sorry for the long answers.
Here's another question, and this is where New York Times hasn't written much at all. But right now, we have the trial going on with John Durham, dealing with the whole Russian collusion, and Danchenko's in trial, and we had Sussman before. I'd love to hear your impressions as to what that trial did, the initial one that led to the Trump's, problem with Congress. How has this affected, all that's gone on with the New York Times, with the country, with, black, white, yellow? We're seeing continually now of more dissension.
You're asking a bunch of questions, but I'll just choose one.
Pick John Durham and the Russian collusion, what that has done to build where we are now.
Well, I mean, look, the Russian collusion story was a false story, which too many in the media pursued because they wanted it to be true, right? Because Trump is a detestable character, so you're prepared to believe anything about him. And I have written about Danchenko. I've written numerous columns about this fact. And it should worry whether you're conservative or liberal, the fact that the FBI, one institution in American government that has rained terror on a lot of people, including civil rights leaders back in the 1960s, all kinds of people, you should be worried that they are operating almost as a supra-legal institution that doesn't hold itself to account. When it turned out that the FBI knew perfectly well that Carter Page was in the service of, shall we say, another agency of American government, while they were essentially fingering him as a potential Russian spy, that was disgraceful. When they were misrepresenting their case in front of the FISA court to Judge Collier, that was disgraceful. And I think that what happened with Danchenko, where it turns out the Steele dossier, everything we know about Trump, prostitutes peeing on the bed at the Ritz-Carlton, all of it was subcontracted to a law firm that had subcontracted essentially an agency that looks for dirt, who went to Steele, who went to Danchenko. Danchenko went to some person he met at a bar who said, oh, I hear this, and this becomes national news, is a serious problem. And it has at its heart an FBI which I think is out of control. And we need to do the FBI what we did to our intelligence agencies after 9/11, or even to the CIA in the 1970s, because it's an out-of-control rogue institution where agents have been allowed to make policy. It is outrageous that Jim Comey intervened in 2016 when it came to Hillary's emails the first time. The second time, what he did with Trump amounted to blackmail of a president-elect. And all of this is totally irrespective of what I feel about Donald Trump. Donald Trump's crimes are all committed in broad daylight, okay? You don't have to go looking under rocks to find what's wrong with the guy. All you have to do is look at the man, listen to him, and you got all the information you require right then and there.
Speaking of institutions, I guess, running wild and free, I'm coming from an 814 class as a first year at the Sanford School of Public Policy. I had a classmate give a very succinct and powerful repudiation of the Supreme Court. I'm curious if you can give an assessment, your assessment of the Supreme Court, its legitimacy or lack thereof.
So I'm someone who thinks that Roe v. Wade was wrongly decided, and I'm also someone who thinks that Dobbs was wrongly decided. Because when a right has been extended for 50 years, it becomes part of the common set of expectations of freedom in the United States. And I wrote a column denouncing the court for the Dobbs decision. I think, and people say, well, if a case was bad in the past, it shouldn't be a super precedent. And I've heard on the right people say, well, Plessy v. Ferguson was obviously a horrible case. It's a good thing that Brown v. Board overturned it. It didn't matter that Plessy v. Ferguson had been law for 8 years before Brown v. Board. My response to that is Plessy v. Ferguson withdrew a right from American citizens, which Brown restored. Whereas Roe, like it or not, extended a right to American citizens, which Dobbs withdraws. And as a result, I think that the court has gravely harmed its legitimacy. It's a shame. I think it's a shame that the decision was leaked or beforehand, because I sometimes wonder in the back of my mind whether Kavanaugh might have been brought over, might have been persuadable before the leak of the decision. He was essentially backed into a corner, but that's a moot point. But I worry, look, America is well served when the court is 5-4, either 5-4 liberal or 5-4 conservative, because it means, A, there's always one justice who gets to be the guy who, or the woman more often who, or as often, almost as often, who gets to make the law, right? And B, because it's important that both sides of the political divide can look to the court and see that from time to time they will have relief for their side of the argument. A 6-3 court, I think, is dangerous for the United States, and I think it's dangerous for the court. I think John Roberts understands this, but I don't think some of his younger colleagues do.
Thank you.
Hi, you spoke earlier about the conversation and about how the need for more civil discourse between people who disagree, and I completely agree with that. But in today's climate, at least you and Gail Collins agree on the same set of facts. There are so many people today.
Not always, but you know.
There are so many people today who think that Joe Biden isn't a legitimate president, or they think that 9/11 didn't occur, or Sandy Hook, wasn't really, didn't really occur. And so, how do we have these conversations with people with whom we disagree if we can't have the same set of facts that we're talking about?
In the same way that porcupines make love, with extreme delicacy. It's an old joke. Look, one thing is for sure, the answer is I don't know, but one thing is for sure, that screaming at another person that they're an idiot, that is, who's spouting nonsense is not a great recipe. And I am thankful for an education at the University of Chicago, which was heavy on some of the classics of political thought. And I think of the way in which Socrates shuts down Thrasymachus in the early books of the Republic by using dialogue and reason to destroy Thrasymachus's argument about justice being the advantage of the stronger. And it's what we're trying to model in our conversation, what I try to do in my columns, that there is something to be said for being kind of insistently reasonable. And more people are won over than you realize. We live in a world in which, unfortunately, everyone has access to a microphone, but only the loudest and most obnoxious people want to grab the microphone. I mean, not right now, but and so we amplify some of the worst voices. Someone was asking me the other day, like, oh, I was reading the comments on your column, and everyone is so angry. How do you handle it? I was like, well, and they asked me if I read the comments. I do, because I have a masochistic streak. And they said, well, doesn't it get under your skin? I said, not really, because frankly, if you're the sort of person with a lot of time on your hands, to start being the person commenting on Bret Stephens' latest outrage to, whatever, I don't care. Busy people aren't doing that. Or they're certainly not screaming in the comments section. So how do we, the real challenge is how do we create various forms of media, including platforms like this one, where we're not elevating angry people. We're not giving them an outsized platform. And it turns out that people like, the folks at Fox or MSNBC, I think their business model is wrong. I think the appetite for something different is much larger than they realize. The problem is not with the demand so much, it's often with the supply. We can do more to supply people with a level of thoughtfulness that just isn't sufficiently there.
So you spoke about the importance of having a healthy conservative party, and I was curious about your perspective on whether the independent party will either become more prevalent or should become more prevalent.
Independent party?
Yeah, both because of just the break apart of the parties now and just kind of the polarization in society?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question, and I wish I had an answer. The American system, especially at the federal level, militates against third parties because of winner-take-all politics and because of the way in which the Electoral College works. And the strongest argument for getting rid of something like the Electoral College is the possibility of having a larger multi-party system that we simply don't have now. There are smart arguments against getting rid of the Electoral College, but that's an argument for another day. What America really needs, this is my fantasy, is a liberal party. And by liberal, I mean liberal in a broad sense. I don't mean Nancy Pelosi liberalism. I mean liberal in the idea of being in the spirit of open, dynamic societies committed to institutions that foster independence of thought and believe in the dignity of every single individual. And we don't have that right now. And there are parts of the Democratic Party which speak very powerfully to that persuasion, particularly when it comes to civil rights. And there are still aspects of the old Republican Party, this is in my view, that speak to that when it comes to free speech and a dynamic, open, free market economy. And there ought to be a possibility of bringing these two strains together. And I often find, like, in the conversations I have, who are the people I find myself really agreeing with? It's usually like people who are like Democrats, but just on the other side of the line from me. And there's something there, but that will only happen in the system that we have when probably the carcass of the Republican Party is buried and something better can come up in its place.
Brett, I committed the cardinal sin of moderation and forgot to bring a time device up to the stage. What time is it? You're wearing a watch.
It is 6:43.
Okay, so we probably can only just
But
take
this guy's been waiting for ages.
No, we're going to take two. We're going to take two more. We're going to take two more questions, but I apologize. We can't do five, or I'm going to make you late to your next thing.
Yeah, thank you so much for this event. This has been really, really awesome. So I have a question. You mentioned that there's a brand of conservatism that tries to protect liberal institutions.
Yeah.
So I'm curious what that brand of conservatism should do when liberal institutions fail. Can conservatives reform institutions? So what would a conservative answer be, for example, to the failures of the market, which you mentioned as an institution to abide by back in 2009? Or say the military and maybe its failures in the last 20 years. How should conservatives reform things? If you have historical examples that are outside the US context, interested in those too.
Sure. Well, you mentioned the military, right? The great reform of the military happened in 1948 with Harry Truman's order to desegregate the military, simply because the military was not abiding by the core liberal principles that ought to be fundamental to American life. Now, Harry Truman was a Democrat, obviously, okay, but in that sense, he was acting, in my view, according to essentially a conservative impulse, which is this was an institution that had to be a national institution if it was going to serve the country, and that's what he made of it. Being a conservative does not mean being in favor of absolutely unfettered, unchecked, Wild West capitalism, and Republicans have known that since the days of Teddy Roosevelt, who was the first and earliest great reformer of the economy. And I don't think anyone makes the argument for like purely unfettered capitalism. 2008 was a failure of capitalism. It was also, to some extent, a failure of not just the regulatory qualities of capitalism, but the injection of far too much federal liquidity and various other kinds of liquidity into a particular kind of market. And so nothing prevents a thoughtful conservative from saying, in general, we support the idea of a free market, right? How we shape that, if you call a free market, it's not really an institution, but how we shape that in the broadest sense, an institution, is up to us, and we can do so thoughtfully and above all, prudentially. And you know, that's just, I think, ordinary ordinary politics. You know, if it had been up to me, if I had been the Ben Bernanke or someone like that in 2007, 2006, I would be worried about Fannie Mae, and I'd be worried about the tremendous investment of money into mortgage-backed securities and the idea that these things were risk-free. I mean, one of the ways in which conservatives can do this is to make sure that when in capitalism, a truly an important consideration is you don't simply socialize risk and privatize profit, and that's kind of what happened in our system in the last 15 years. A profound and good question, I might add.
That was a good question. Okay, so in conservative media, especially online, a lot of the conversation tends to revolve around cultural and social issues, like broadly speaking. Like there's like so many you could name, like issues of gender, sexual ethics, like race, things like that tend to dominate the conversations a lot more than, I guess, maybe like economic issues might have previously. And so my question is, like, in the conservative movement, do you think that these issues, like the urgency with which they're treated and the attention they get, do you think that's warranted, or do you think that conversation should revolve more around issues of like economics and things like that? And I think that like these issues, they're being so prevalent is represented by somebody like Ron DeSantis being like a darling of the right, because he is seen as like, among people on the right, as like an effective policymaker who's addressing these issues when others aren't. So what are your thoughts?
I guess my thought is it's not up to me to dictate to people what it is that they should be interested in. And cultural issues matter because they go to fundamental questions of how we identify not just ourselves, but how we think of our communities. And I think that the left is frequently remiss in not understanding that changes to broadly held cultural understandings, especially if there are changes that feel imposed and feel sudden and feel abrupt and unexplained, are not going to go down well. I mean, 10 years ago, the idea that you would identify your pronouns at the bottom of an email was just like absolutely unthinkable. And it's strange to many people that this suddenly became not just something people did, but something people were expected, in fact, required to do. And so you can't just expect that you are going to enact and sometimes socially enforce these changes without it being a subject of conversation. The left doesn't say, look, our lane is culture and we're not going to have anything to say about the structure of the economy, and the right's not going to say that either. And I'm certainly not going to tell them what it is that they should care about. What I do care about, though, is that in a free and democratic society, the best way in which to advance social change is through mechanisms of persuasion and inclusion, not condescension, derision, and rulemaking or diktats from on high. And I think would be probably in a healthier place socially if that were the way in which we try to advance our ideas or advance our causes. And yeah.
Bring us home.
Okay, so I had one question about like the concept of objectivity in journalism, and you kind of just touched on that just now. So like in your journalism, like you share an interpretation of the happenings of the world versus like typical news approaches, which aim for objectivity and like framing what they are presenting as facts. And I think that can lead to people thinking that what is actually their opinion is a fact, and like lead to the inability to have conversations and the condescension that you mentioned here. And so I was wondering, how do you think the inability of political parties to have productive conversations comes from like this misleading construct of objectivity?
Well, I don't know if objectivity is a misleading construct. I think objectivity is a very useful ideal. And it's a particularly useful ideal in the world in which, Frank and I grew up of journalism. And it's one that we abandon at our peril. It is absolutely the case that nobody except the Almighty is ever going to know the truth, the absolute perfect truth about any subject. But we in journalism, and also I think in the academic enterprise, are trying to build up a possibility. we are operating with the idea that understanding the truth is possible, and that the worthiest thing in life is that it should be pursued. And the best way in which to pursue it is by assembling facts like bricks upon bricks in the assembly of a cathedral. And that is what we should be doing. And the fact that we are abandoning, too many people seem to be abandoning the possibility of objectivity, is what leads to the circumstance we have now, in which, contrary to Daniel Patrick Moynihan's great line, everybody seems to feel like they're entitled to their own set of facts. And that's really helps explain, I think, the breakdown in a lot of democratic discourse today, that people are just arriving at what is supposed to be a shared conversation with totally separate fact bases. You can argue about the meaning of facts. That's what Frank and I do all the time. That's our job as opinion columnists. But we should make great efforts to establish common sets of facts. It's not always possible. But the fact that it's not always possible does not mean we shouldn't be making every effort to uphold the idea that any sane and genuinely progressive society operates with the idea that it should pursue a concept of truth based on observable facts. That's, I think, foundational. And without it, there's no journalism, there's no academia. They're just competing centers of power struggling with one another to see who has the biggest mallet to hit the other side over the head. Last comment before I go. What a wonderful audience. What incredible questions. I'm so honored to share the stage with you, Frank. I didn't know what to. Frank came and said, you're probably going to get about 6 people in the audience. And
I like to set low expectations.
And to speak at an institution like Duke is a profound honor. And so thank you for sharing the evening with me.
Thank you, Brett. Thank you.